Well, our next journey takes us looking for ancient technology. Jason Martell will join us, along with Amish Shah, a producer and director. That'll be next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. Oh, there's no researcher like Jason Martell when it comes to digging up ancient artifacts, ancient technologies. He's been doing this for more than 15 years. So he's one of the leading researchers and lecturers that specialize in ancient advanced technologies. He's working on his next scientific creation of ancient technology based upon data from the Sumerian cylinder seals that we've talked about. They're from 3000 BC. He's also working on a new project, which he's going to announce for us right here on Coast to Coast. Jason, looking forward to this tonight. How are you?
Hey, George. Thanks so much for having me back on.
So what are you up to these days?
Well, with all the popularity of the TV show Ancient Aliens, a lot of the followers of the show are so filled with passion that they want to dive in deeper and are always making comments, oh, you should talk about this angle or that angle. So what I've done is partnered with another gentleman named Amish Shah. And
he's going to join us in about 30 minutes or so.
Nice. Yeah, and so Amish and I have started a new platform called Ancient Explorers, where pretty much, George, we're going to be crowdsourcing where we're going to shoot our next documentary and, do a tour and bring people along with us. The difference here is simply that the amount of resources that we're, putting together from my side and Amish's, and kind of an understanding that there is this lost part of our history that we really need to explore outside of mainstream science.
That's exciting. So when is your next unveiling?
Well, to debut on your show tonight, we're doing a live screening tomorrow night, and essentially this documentary is around an area in India called Dwarka, and it's potentially a lost underwater city at this point. Right off the coast, right off the coast of India, there's literally a city that's twice the size, potentially, of Manhattan. So,
wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. It would definitely be a new blip on the megalithic world monument grid, and it really hasn't received a lot of attention. And so Amish, when you bring him on, I'm sure will explain, he went firsthand and spent, quite a period of time investigating this area, Dwarka, and kind of discovered a cover-up, literal cover-up of not being able to figure out why these excavations off the coast of India stopped. And it's a very interesting journey that we're going down to kind of open this door on Dwarka and show how it relates to the other megalithic sites around the world that are still kind of making us scratch our heads.
That sounds exciting. You're constantly looking for ancient artifacts and technology, aren't you?
I am, George. I do make a living with modern technology, but I definitely love ancient technology. It seems more and more that we're finding pieces or evidence, artifacts, sites that are pushing back the needle of time to, right now we humbly put it on the shoulders of the Sumerians at 3800 BC, but we're starting to find artifacts and sites that are pushing back that date to 50,000 BC. So there's really a large gap here, right, that we need to catch up, and there are some new ways that we're utilizing science of modern technology and views of the ancient past to hopefully give us a clearer lens into our future.
Michael Cremo, who was with me last week, he just loves these discussions on ancient civilizations, and of course, as you know, Jason, believes that humankind, much older than most people think.
Michael's the man. He's actually definitely one of the experts in the Dwarka documentary, and that's probably the line that we're looking at again is utilizing some of this lost knowledge, where most of the ancient cultures, over 30 in fact, seem to have a much more accurate system of time based on astronomy. And that's one angle that we keep in focus. The other, George, is the geological evidence. And so what we're seeing is there are sites like Lake Titicaca or Giza, And you can see that at one point, as an example, the Nile lapped on the shores of the Great Pyramids. But now, if you look at Google Maps, you'll notice this great divide of where the Nile has now meandered over time many, many miles away from where it used to be. That's geological evidence that we can look at why the Nile has moved how many years to its current position. Same thing with Lake Titicaca. There are sites like Pumapunku and Sacsayhuaman, all these great sites that used to lap right on the shores of Lake Titicaca. Now they don't. So there's a lot of geological evidence as well as astronomical alignments that are starting to give us a clearer perspective in mapping out these sites and possibly dating them more accurately.
I suspect ancient India was extremely sophisticated. You agree?
I definitely agree. And it seems that, if we look at the Mahabharata and some of these other ancient references to India, India's past goes just as deep, if not further, than all the great cultures, Egyptian, Sumerian. India also seemed to have that great rise to civilization in the 3000 BC era.
Jason, we're going to get in with Amish a lot about India specifically, but let's talk about some of the other things that you've been investigating of late. Does Sumeria pop into it?
It does, of course. The thing that ties back into my roots with the Sumerian culture is the astronomical evidence. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Sumerian tablets written in stone in this ancient cuneiform script that record the movements of the heavens, the positions of the stars, literally over hundreds of years as sacred information. They would only pass this down amongst high astronomy priests. And if you were to ask a certain Sumerian priest on what day there would be a lunar eclipse 50 years from now, he could tell you the exact day. So they monitored the movements of the heavens very accurately, and it turns out there are literally, thousands of tablets, most of them maybe not all astronomy-based, but a good batch of them. There are tablets around the world, George, still in our museums, that are not being rotated into public display. They're just sitting in a box, not translated, waiting to be discovered. So, again, whether it be artifacts or locations, we need to kind of put this all into a big mixing pot of our lost history, disregard mainstream science of these individual views, and come up with a new one that makes sense for everyone.
Jason, big time with the movie Noah that's out these days. And, of course, it talks about the flood, the biblical version, and, a little Hollywood included in that. But,
yes.
Most experts will agree that there was some kind of calamity on this planet a long time ago and that it was a great flood. Was that tied into, because some people believe this too, the planet X that Zecharia Sitchin has written about?
Of course, that conversation would come up. And yes,
of course.
I still am a firm believer, George. I was raised as a Christian, and so when I watch movies like Noah, I have a deeper respect for it now, realizing that the veracity of these stories, the biblical veracity, is actually upheld in tracing the roots of these stories to the Sumerian versions. And literally, in the British Museum, there is a tablet, a stone tablet, on display called the Flood Tablet. And it describes word for word the same English story of Noah that we have in the New King James Version, but in the Sumerian epic, where it's a Sumerian man chosen by a Sumerian god called an Anunnaki to build a large craft and take all the animals and plants and things around him because there was going to be a large flood. Now, the reason why, obviously, George, people that know of this knowledge find it much more interesting or intriguing is the Bible, for instance, in English has 7 days of creation, but the Sumerian version has 7 stone tablets of creation, part of a much longer epic. So it's kind of like the English version is a consolidated story of these sacred stories that have been passed down through the English version and the New King James New Testament, the Hebrew version in the Old Testament. There are Akkadian, and it filters all the way back into Sumerian stone versions of a great flood that, as you mentioned, yes, in the expanded stone tablets, it talks about a large planet that as it passed by Earth in the past, cracked off a part of our ice sheet and instantly raised the water levels. So, yes, there is definitely geological evidence, George, where we can look for a global flood, looking at sediment layers and things like that point to certain dates of 10 to 13,000 BC of some type of great global calamity.
The underwater kingdom of Dwarka, was that tied into the flood?
Well, that's a good question, George. And, it's really going to be up to people like myself and Amish and Graham Hancock and others that can find the resources to look into these appropriately. As an example, NASA, a few years ago, came up with some really interesting archaeological technology called synthetic aperture radar. And they essentially loaded a 747 packed with all this ground-penetrating radar and sensors, and they flew it over Cambodia. And in a certain area there, they found pyramids that were covered by brush and slightly underground. So if we were to fly, the synthetic aperture radar from NASA's partnership right over Dwarka, I bet you we could find some very interesting topography. If we can't partner with NASA, maybe we deploy our own commercial-grade drones, both above the surface and underwater.
Yeah, maybe so.
A lot of options for us to explore.
What about artifacts that are left behind? And, we'll get into the city with Amish, but in terms of, tablets or drawings or anything, is there anything out there?
Well, there's let me put it two ways. So there's two things. The evidence that we have on the stone monuments is kind of a classic question that I'm answering over and over for. People always ask, what's the best evidence on ancient aliens to prove that aliens visited us? And it's not a specific artifact or monument. It's actually what I call vitrification, vitrified. And this is a term that tells us when a stone has been superheated to a magma-like state, you can then manipulate it like putty. So all over the world, we see these sites like Sacsayhuaman and Machu Picchu, Pumapunku, where they've come up with a building style where they're able to literally take granite, diorite, the hardest stones on Earth, and get them into a magma-like state where they're like putty. And then it's very easy to sculpt them, shape them, stick them together, and then they harden back into stone without mortar, perfectly fit. So that's definitely, George, one of the pieces of evidence where we can look around the sites around the world and see this evidence of high heat molding of the stones. That raises a flag. To your point specifically, where are the tools? Where's the high technology from the ancients that they had to have had? And this really raises a lot of questions. We've never really found any ancient high technology as far as a tool, but what we do see are representations of technology where ancient man went to great lengths building models and replicas of things they were witnessing at that time. Let's say 3000 BC. As Amish will attest, in the Mahabharata, 3000 BC, it's filled with stories of gods having aerial battles, literally the Hindu god Krishna occupying and living at the city of Dwarka. 3000 BC, now, we have that same time frame of the Anunnaki and the Sumerians interacting.
Does that mean, though, that we had that technology, flying machines, Vimanas, or that we were visited by ETs and these were theirs?
That's the question, George. I lean more towards now that whether they were aliens or other beings of a higher dimension, extraterrestrial or not, that more than likely ancient man was witnessing their technology, at least in the 3000 BC era, not so much us, like you and I, flying around in a spaceship.
And then they just left.
And then they appeared to have left. And that's another part of the story, is we see evidence around the world of some type of global ancient nuclear war. But who had nuclear weapons in 3000 BC? So this really raises a lot of questions as to this evidence of ancient technology in the past, meaning we have very accurate witnesses, ancient people around the world describing flying craft and weapons that they called comets that were directed at a city, particle weapons, and all these types of things that today we can attribute to more of a technological reference rather than at that time just a natural reference. They didn't have anything technological as a layer or a lens to look through.
So the ancient literature, of course, is where Oppenheimer got the idea for atomic weapons, isn't it?
It is, and he's actually quoted a scripture from the Mahabharata about the brilliance of the blast of a nuclear weapon. And so there are many scholars along the path of time, great scholars, whether it be well in our past like Archimedes in the Greek philosophy, or Copernicus, Galileo, definitely people that have changed our perspective on how we view the ancient past with a firm grasp on modern technology. So it's always interesting, George. Another example, the Hadron Collider at CERN is a big circle where we essentially use high-powered magnets and collide particles and discover the essence of the universe at a subatomic level. They've got a huge statue erected in front of the Hadron Collider of the Hindu god Shiva, and he's inside of a large circle always doing his dance, which is a representation from even ancient times that everything had to be broken down to its basic pieces in order to recreate from the new, to create something new. So it's almost like this ancient knowledge is embedded. All the things that we're learning today, even of particle physics, are embedded in the ancient knowledge, and we just need to understand and decipher it.
It's just amazing that this lost information, Jason, just seems to be gone. People like you, of course, research it, dig for it. But, I mean, there's no logical transition, is there?
George, it's kind of scary in some ways. It's like someone invented the fork, and it's always been in front of us, but you don't realize its importance until you see something new like the spork. My point is, it's right in front of us, George. We just don't see it. Last point here about this circular magnetic flow. If we look at the Hadron Collider and understand that it's magnets powered around the edge, most of these megalithic sites like Stonehenge and various others where there's these stacked stones also have polar magnetic opposites in the stones embedded in them. When we look at the Germans using this thing called the Bell, this UFO-type thing that was in a circular stone structure and launched, there's some type of connection with magnetic energy, megalithic sites, and breaking down things into its subatomic particle state that we're just starting to tap into now. But again, a lot of these ancient sites have this knowledge embedded in them. We just didn't understand why, but we're starting to make connections with modern science.
All right, stay with us, Jason. We're going to bring in Amish Shah in a moment to talk more about this underwater kingdom in India, find out exactly how far deep it is, what happened to it. We'll talk also about the flying machines, the Vimanas, and so much more when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. Well, next hour, we're going to take your phone calls with Jason Martell, and Amish Shah joins us next as we talk about more of their work in Underwater Kingdom. That stuff fascinates me, and I hope you too, when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Jason Martell with us, and let me tell you about Amish Shah. Amish's fascination with ancient civilizations, like all of us, lost cities, exotic locales, started when he was a little child. He longed for the freedom to explore the most far-off sections of the planet as well, and here he is on Coast to Coast. Amish, welcome.
Hi, how are you, George?
Good, looking
Jason,
forward to
how are
this.
you?
Hey, Jason, come aboard and tell us a little bit about the relationship with Amish.
Yes, well, Amish is a very interesting character. I have quite a bit of respect for Amish. He and I crossed paths in the business world and then quickly realized that we were also like-minded in spirit and a passion for ancient sites. And when I realized that Amish had spent the unbelievable amount of time that he had looking into these topics of Dwarka, actually creating a documentary, we just realized that it was probably a good idea to align our forces.
Good. Now tell us about Dwarka, Amish. Whereabouts is it? How deep is it? What happened to it?
Yeah, sure. So Dwarka is an ancient city that was mentioned in the Mahabharata text. The Mahabharata text was what considered mythical for a very long time because of the crazy concepts that were involved inside of the book and some of the things that they talked about. As they started going on and they started doing more research on these scriptures, they found archaeological evidence of a city called Dwarka. Now, there is a current city of Dwarka off the west coast of India, near the state of, or in the state of Gujarat, I should say, all the way on the west coast. So, that little piece of India that kind of sticks out on the left-hand side, it's right there, basically. And so they talk about this land Dwarka inside the Mahabharata, where there was a war. And this war was of quite a magnificent war. The Mahabharata, again, is an epic poem. That's one of the world's longest poems. In fact, I think it is the world's longest poem that has ever been recorded. And so it was a description of this war, and specifically one of the areas was Dwarka. And Dwarka was a city where they said Lord Krishna was said to have lived. Now, again, growing up, I am Indian myself, so I grew up with stories of Krishna and all this stuff, but, you tend to think it's just a mythical thing because it's just this guy or this god, and you don't know. He was involved in these wars and all this kind of, interesting, weird topics, growing up as a kid. So that always fascinated me. Is this real? Was this an account of real events? So Dwarka was first discovered in the 1960s off the west coast of India by Dr. S.R. Rao. S.R. Rao, Dr. Rao was a huge proponent of discovering more of Dwarka. In fact, they were building on top of Dwarka first. When they did some excavations around the shoreline, they found a 550-meter wall. And they were like, this is interesting. Obviously, it was covered by sand. And then they later started to find a temple. And this temple goes back to roughly 1200 or so A.D. It's called Dwarkadish Temple. And it's in the city of Dwarka right now. What's interesting about this temple, Dwarkadish, again, the city of Dwarka is where Lord Krishna is said to have lived. And it was a city where it was made out of gold. And there was palaces, and there was, abundant amount of food, and people were happy, and, it was quite literally heaven on earth, so they described in these texts. So that's kind of just a background of Dwarka itself and the Great War that happened. And obviously there was much more information as they started discovering more information.
Now, why hasn't it been publicized that much, Amish?
Well, I think it's because it's fairly new. If you consider that the full published reports and the book didn't really come out until the 90s, and then they stopped the excavations. It was kind of right before, the big, I guess you could say, internet boom. And so I don't think it really got much attention. And, along my journey in discovering Dwarka, that took me out to the city of Dwarka. I actually went there myself to discover out why I was kind of getting the runaround. And this is where the story kind of gets interesting. As I was researching, I looked into organizations that did the research at Dwarka, and I reached out to the members, some of the divers, some of the archaeologists, and some of the people that were involved in the digs and the excavations. And I just couldn't get a proper answer from anybody, and that is really what led me to go out there and discover why they stopped the excavations and why no one was basically answering me. And upon getting there, I went on this whole other journey, and this is all part of the documentary. It's in the documentary that's in there. It's really powerful. And you start to look at why this information was being suppressed, and you're led to the conclusion of either A, it could literally rewrite history, and that could cause a lot of turmoil and conflict and a lot of problems across the world. And, there's evidence of things going back in the Gulf of Cambay, which is right near Dwarka, which goes back 7,500 BC. So it's...
And, Amish, if you went underwater,
Mm-hmm.
What would you see?
Well, they found, as they were doing their sonar scanning, I think this was late in the 80s and 90s, they found a city twice the size of Manhattan off the coast. And this city has never been excavated. They've actually only gone 40 to 50 feet deep into the waters, and that's because they just didn't have the right equipment, and, I don't think they had enough, technology to go deeper because of the currents. But with, modern-day technology, we could definitely go. Dr. S.R. Rao was in full agreement that this city existed and was the city that was mentioned in the Mahabharata, because what they did find, a very conclusive piece of evidence, was something which they called a mudra. And a mudra was something that they wore around their neck, and it was a form of identification in the city of Dwarka. And it was a three-headed animal that you would put on your neck, basically, as a form of identification. During this big war, they needed to know who the people were. They found one of these three-headed identification stones in that same exact location of Dwarka, and this is also talked about in the Mahabharata text itself as well. So this is, double powerful. It's really cool to find this information.
Jason, I want to bring you in here with Amish and talk about the Vimanas now, which have always fascinated me. When I was interviewed for Ancient Aliens about that specific area, it has been for me one of the most perplexing yet exciting parts of anything we've ever talked about, these ancient flying machines, which, Jason, you and I just talked about the possibility that they were really E.T. as opposed to homegrown, basically. But I want to get both of your takes, so both of you jump in. Jason, you first.
Sure. Well, I often get criticized for being on Ancient Aliens and that everything is built by aliens, and not so much, George. I really don't know whether or not Vimanas were being powered by aliens, like was Lord Krishna an alien, or was he some type of interdimensional higher being? I don't know, but how I'm looking at this evidence of Vimanas and all around the world, right, in Mesoamerica, we have the little mislabeled insect models that clearly look like planes, or in Egypt, similar, again, aircraft models. So various descriptions of either rockets or Vimanas coming out of ancient times. I don't know if they were extraterrestrial or not, but the key fact is they were viewed as gods and they came from somewhere. They were always depicted flying in the skies. So I'm definitely hooked too, George, and I think, obviously it would be nice to actually uncover a Vimana or some type of ancient flying craft. But definitely we can look at the astronomical evidence, and we can come back to that topic with Dr. Narahari Ashar's evidence from the documentary and some interesting correlations. But, yeah, the Vimanas and these flying craft raise a lot of questions.
What do you think, Amish? What are they?
So Vimanas were used several times in the Mahabharata. In fact, I believe they were used over 17 times, and they were used in several other texts as well. Now, Vimanas can be interpreted as quite literally aerial machines, but they've also talked about them as superpowers of some sort, or a superpower of some sort, and you had to activate some kind of energy to activate that superpower. And so you have these different references of Vimanas all across these ancient scriptures, and specifically in the Mahabharata, right by Dwarka, where the big war took place. They said 4 million soldiers died in a couple of days. And it was King Salva, who they say King Salva came and asked the gods for a flying machine or a machine of that he can attack the city of Dwarka with. Now, King Salva was Krishna's opponent, and then he said that he came from the heavens with a flying machine, and this machine would appear in one place at times, multiple places at times. It would disappear. It would make an interesting noise. And it would start firing missiles or fiery things at the city of Dwarka, basically, from his Vimana. Lord Krishna then, basically, since he was under attack, again, this is going back to the ancient technology piece of it, shot a ground-to-air missile, or, converted into English, I guess that's the best way to explain it, and cracked the Vimana, and the remains had fell into the sea by Dwarka. Now, again, this goes back to reference what Jason was mentioning, the astronomical proof of something like this, that it can actually exist. Now, we found archaeological proof that Dwarka exists, and we've also found proof that, Vimanas exist inside the Mahabharata, right? We've found that this city actually exists. Now, the third piece that we were kind of missing was the exact astronomical references, work done by Dr. Narhari Achar from the University of Memphis. He took all the conjunctions of planets that happened during the Mahabharata, that was written in the Mahabharata, and he put them in astronomy software. And then he backdated all of those dates, and this exact war took place in 3067 BC, down to the exact planet in its particular house, with the waxing and waning moon. The details are exactly laid out in this ancient scripture when they say the Vimana came from the sky.
That's exciting, Jason and Amish. It's great.
It really is, George. And so you start to get an understanding that, again, there are hundreds of what we call mythological texts that we have available to us where we can, look at this information and, again, very detailed analysis of astronomical reference points, geological information, and we can start to actually use the stars, the movements of the heavens, just like the ancients did, and pinpoint exact time frames for when these things took place. As Amish just said, if we could literally find an ancient UFO or a Vimana that crashed off the shore of India and through excavation find a fragment or a piece, we change the whole game.
What else are they finding, Jason, that might be of interest?
Well, there's all kinds of artifacts that pop up, right? As an example, in 1901, off the coast of Antikythera, they found the Antikythera mechanism, which I know you're well aware of. Mm-hmm. And so there's pieces like this that, the Antikythera mechanism discovered in 1901, let's say 30 or 40 years later, maybe even 60 years later in the 60s, they start to look at the Antikythera mechanism under radar and realize it's got over 35 cogs and wheels interconnected. It's more complicated than a modern-day Swiss watch. Now, to them, right, being discovered in 1901 and just a few decades of research, this thing really stood out. To us today, yes, it's a 2,000-year-old device, possibly built by Archimedes, we don't know, but it was used to calculate the motions and movements of the heavens. So there are other devices like this, George, that we can start to hone in on. Another one, as an example, Egypt is loaded with sites like this. We have in Dendera on the ceiling this wall relief called the Dendera Zodiac, and what it shows is the view of the skies above Giza at 8,000 BC, not 2,500 BC, thousands of years before the Egyptian culture should have existed. So they either had this knowledge of this larger cycle of time and were pointing back to an epoch of time when they were in the golden age, if you will, or the Egyptian culture extends much further back into the history books than we currently think it does.
Where do you go next with all this, Amish? I mean, what's next to discover?
So we want to go back out to Dwarka and start the excavations and see what we can come up with and get the permits and go out there and really just go out there and find what we're looking for and find this lost kingdom, even if it's just remnants of something like Jason was mentioning. Let's just go there and find it. I mean, considering that they've only been 50 to 60 feet out max, it's not that far. 50 to 60 feet down, sorry. It's not that far considering what technology we have nowadays and the interest level that is peaking for this kind of information at the moment, because it's very powerful. That's what we want to do. And not just Dwarka. We have, Jason and I are are launching an education. This is kind of rewriting the history books, because this kind of information that we've been sharing is very powerful, and it's just scratching the surface of what it is truly that we're trying to discover here.
Will they let you try to discover more
Will
things?
they let us? We don't know yet until we try.
George, really, there's a battle here of politics and religion, and if I try and come at this research solely from the ancient aliens angle, which I wouldn't do, but if I tried to do that, I probably wouldn't get very far. If we come at it from a sole academic source, then there is very easy ways to get public access. We have to kind of meet in the middle. There are definitely ways where we can approach what we're looking at using scientific means without maybe exposing our overall goals of being a little bit more open about what we find. So I'm not so much interested in having an agenda or trying to push a certain theory, but we definitely want to approach these sites and get access using more mainstream academic means, and showing that we're going to be deploying technology and using scientific means to simply look for answers and leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. And
go ahead,
just to add on top of Jason, it's really the introduction of the film. Again, it's an education, that we're trying to make an awareness, and I think that is exactly the point with what we've created with the film.
Now, if people want to watch this film, where do they see it? Jason?
You can go to ancientfilm.com. It'll just take you to our website.
Jason, you've been doing this for a long time. Is this one of the most exciting projects you've encountered?
It's starting to get really exciting, George. The Dwarka documentary is definitely one of the more exciting aspects of what I've been involved in. I'm just really excited to see that Amish and I have formed this partnership, because as your audience is going to see, we're going to go down a path of exploration, but bring everyone with us. Literally, the next site we go to beyond Dwarka is going to be crowdsourced. We already have over 130,000 fans on Facebook, George. So the next location we go to, Machu Picchu, Sacsayhuaman, really don't know. We're going to leave it up to the audience, and they're going to come along with us, and we're going to document this using technology so that people can either join in through Ancient Explorers or come hands-on with us to the location.
All right, Jason, we're going to keep you and come right back with phone calls. Amish, thank you. We'll be back. Okay, in this hour, we will take your phone calls as we continue our conversation with Jason Martell as we talk about ancient worlds on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast, Jason Martell with us. Jason, in terms of the exploring of finding this underwater kingdom, Dwarka, any technology spotted down there?
Well, no, not yet. As Amish mentioned, they just kind of hovered over the surface about 50 meters or 50 feet even, 50 or 60 feet. So there's really nothing at the surface level, on the ocean surface level, that's actually been excavated. But aerial views show that there's something possibly twice the size of Manhattan.
Isn't that amazing?
That sounds like a pretty good amount of space to probably do a proper excavation, and who knows what we'd find.
How deep down?
I'm not exactly sure of how far off the coast you need to go. I'd probably transfer that more to Amish. But again, it's right off the coast. And if we look at right off the area there, the Gulf of Cambay, which is just around 200 miles away, we have similar edifices that are probably just a few hundred feet off the coast. So I would assume it's probably something similar at Dwarka as well.
That's exciting.
It is. And, what's interesting, George, is that there's always banter of modern archaeologists looking at these sites when an alternative view is discovered or put forth based on evidence or excavations. There's always this banter between the modern view and alternative views. And I noticed recently, as an example, an article that got a lot of publicity was how they possibly were using wet sand to move some of those megalithic monuments like in Egypt. I don't know if you saw that, but it's interesting that, even today, right, in 2014, we're still looking back at the claimed procedures of how they possibly built the pyramids or were moving large edifices. We don't know. Even today, the latest theory is, they were using wet sand to move large objects.
Yeah,
well,
I couldn't believe that one.
I know, and that's great, and I'm sure you can move certain objects, but it does not explain things like we discussed earlier, the evidence of vitrification, mortarless fitting of these stones, or the idea that the architecture, the planning of these monuments align to places in space, points in space where they could not have done this without the knowledge of precession, that where literally the heavens are moving, and to have a fixed point wouldn't be possible. It's like they have to know all of the movements to make these alignments happen. So it's very interesting when we start to realize the technology embedded all around us in these ancient sites.
Might Dwarka have been Atlantis?
Yes, I think that's part of the larger scope, and I wouldn't say it's Atlantis. Up till now, George, right, our history books teach the idea that, well, mythologically or on the perimeter of reality, there was some lost high civilization that was on a continent and it sunk into the ocean. And that's about all we get. The reality of that story is that there's a bigger epic to explain that if there was a lost ancient civilization, it affected all the great cultures we have today. They would have been a global society. And George, that's exactly what I'm seeing in my research is there is some lost culture that pushes the date back to, let's say, 50,000 BC. But all we have now, or all we've been able to figure out up to this point, is all the great cultures, the Egyptians, Mayans, Sumerians, even Hindu, they all have pieces of this lost knowledge that used astronomy as a much more accurate base of time and as a calendar. And embedded with that is this lost technology. So it seems that all the great ancient cultures were influenced by some lost great civilization that we're just now starting to figure out.
All right, let's go to the phones. We go to Tim, truck driving in Alabama on the wild card line. Hey, Tim, go ahead. There you go.
How you doing, George?
Good, Timmy. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to hear the show. I love it. Question is, I used to watch Ancient Aliens, and I believe John Lear was on it one time. It's talking about going back into the future with aircraft. I was wondering about that battle that was being depicted there with the shooting of the missile. Could it be possible that we did find a way back in ancient times and they saw one of our craft?
Wow, that's a very interesting question, and I'd answer that from my own personal opinion rather than the evidence pointing to anything in that lineage. There is definitely research that shows possibly the Roswell craft was not only a spacecraft but some type of time machine. We were utilizing some type of technology back then in finding the Roswell craft that would allow us to keep sending it back in time. So if that is in any way true, then it's very possible that, yes, we'd be also utilizing this technology to go look at some of the ancient, megalithic sites and battles and things that have taken place.
Jason, when you started getting involved in this, what did you stumble across that really became the focus for what you wanted to do and just kept driving you?
Well, originally it was based more in modern ufology, and I don't really focus on that just because it's not very healthy. But I started to quickly shift towards all these ancient megalithic sites, and really I latched onto the information of Zecharia Sitchin in realizing that a lot of our ancient cultures and past could be migrated or pinpointed towards this ancient Sumerian culture, and realizing that there is a deeper epoch of understanding to our current ancient texts.
Next up, let's go to Glenn at Port Huron, Michigan. Hey, Glenn, thanks for calling.
Hey, good evening, guys. How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Jason, great to talk to you. George, great to talk to you, too. And is there a third party?
No, it's just the three of us.
I was thinking. All right, what I was going to do was I was going to give a mention and maybe a joke. I'm a little nervous. I know I'm talking in front of millions of people. But I was just wondering some theories that, like Christopher Dunn that's on the show, Ancient Aliens.
Yeah.
The precision of the Great Pyramid.
He believes it's a power plant.
Exactly. The water that's pumped up underneath and the 8 sides that are seen during the equinox, right? It's and the veins. Well, with the chemical mixture, it's almost like they got it going like a heartbeat, like a heart to produce the energy. I was just wondering if anybody had given a thought to that. And just a joke is that why there's so many pyramids around. Well, in the Bible, Nimrod built a tower, and they came down and tore it down. So God came, and no, God, we're not building towers. They're pyramids. So, and you guys do a great job on Ancient Aliens, and your show sounds like it's going to be great, Jason. And thank you. And just if you want to mention that, that'd be great.
All right. Do you know Chris Dunn? He's been on the program with me several times, Jason.
I first spoke with Chris Dunn in Amsterdam about 10 years ago, and he had a broken leg. So, the caller is actually well informed over his topics and the slight comments that he made. And, you know, it is very interesting that there is a geodetic setup of megalithic sites around the world, Giza being one of those. They're all attached to ley lines and mathematical patterns of some type of large energy grid that existed in ancient times. And Giza, George, I can't answer his question long enough for this part, but the Twitter answer is it's very possible that the Ark of the Covenant, the actual Ark, was a great power reactor literally powering the Great Pyramid. And I say that simply because there is a pharaoh that took an exodus and left Egypt with his people, and his name was Akhenaten, and he is possibly also known as Moses. But that's a deeper story. There was an episode of Ancient Aliens that did cover the Ark of the Covenant as being shown all throughout Egypt before the Great Exodus. Literally, the Ark is depicted all over Egypt, this box with 2 poles on a pole on each side carrying it as a large energy device. And the dimensions of the Ark fit the sarcophagus, or what we call the sarcophagus, in the Great Pyramid dimension-wise accurately. It literally could have fit right in there. So if it was, as the Bible described, this thing of smoke and flames and fire and energy, it was possibly a large energy reactor.
What do you see as the most compelling piece of evidence with regards to ancients, technology, and a possible ET tie-in?
Well, I actually answered that earlier, but I'll touch on it again. And I wish I had a sexier answer, but simply it's called vitrification. What we see, George, is around the world, most of these megalithic sites that use a mortarless technology, they've built these huge megalithic stone structures with no mortar, but yet everything's fit together perfectly. The only way they could have done this was to be superheating stones like granite and diorite until it's in a magma-like state. And then the stones can fit together like putty. You can carve intricate diagrams and perfect shapes, almost like cookie-cutter diagrams like we see in Puma Punku of these Lego-like blocks. There's no way to explain they could have been doing this without the introduction of a high level of a heat source, which we can attribute to ancient man. There is no technology that we've uncovered from 3000 BC to explain how they could have built a lot of these sites.
Next up, we go east. Anne is in Toronto and now on Coast to Coast. Hello, Anne.
Hello.
Hi there.
I was just wondering, earlier you touched on base with the name Sheba. I was wondering if you could explain that a little more.
I personally do not remember using the reference of Sheba, but
I think Amish may have used it.
Yeah, I was just going to say Amish might have mentioned that from the Hindu understandings of the Mahabharata or some of these ancient Hindu scriptures that we still have in existence today.
These ancient writings, the Vedics and everything else, how far back do they go?
They go back about 10,000 years. And that really raises the eyebrows because most of our ancient texts revolve around Egypt or ancient Iraq, which we call Sumer, and these speak of times and epochs that are around 4000 BC. But the Mahabharata and some of these Hindu scriptures talk about epochs that extend well into the 10,000 BC era. So it really raises a lot of questions about, again, the veracity of what they're saying and us trying to, pinpoint these locations that are spoken about in ancient times.
What do you think Krishna might have been, Jason?
Well, Krishna, is an interesting god in the sense that he's depicted as a blue being, and most of these Hindu gods had the ability to appear, just like Buddha, in multiple locations at once. Today we would call that some type of cloak technology or holographic technology to fool your enemy, where you all of a sudden flip it on like in Avengers or one of those movies with, the Marvel comics, where they could use some power and all of a sudden have multiple beings appear from one person. So there are literally descriptions of Krishna and various other Hindu gods flying in ancient craft and utilizing this type of power to appear in multiple locations and that sort of thing. That we have to wonder today, at least I do, is it not mythology? A lot of the other pieces we're starting to flip over and uncover have an actual scientific connection to today that we can actually put into perspective and say, wow, this isn't a mythological tale. This can be now vetted with our own modern science. We need to look further.
Joe is in Homer, Alaska. Hey, Joe, thanks for joining us.
Well, it's nice to be here. Hi, George. Hi, Jason.
Hey.
Hi.
This is kind of synchronistic because I've been reading a book called Sunburst, Return of the Ancients by Norman Paulson. I wonder if Jason's ever heard or George has ever heard of this book. It was written in 1980.
I have not. How about you, Jason?
Nope, you got me there, but sounds interesting.
Now that we have to look at it now.
Well, the reason I mention this is because they go back, or he goes back, 350,000 years ago. And he said that was the first advent of celestial beings.
Well, that would be in alignment with the research of Zechariah Sitchin, who looked at the Sumerian cuneiform tablets and deduced that they explain that these beings, the Anunnaki, literally landed in South Africa 300,000 years ago, mining gold in these veins that were found in southern Africa. So the dating seems to be accurate with other high scholars.
And created us because they got too lazy to mine the gold, right?
Well, that appears to be the case, George, yes.
And here we are. Ancient Explorers, that's your new work in the documentary. How long does it run, Jason?
Well, Ancient Explorers, as Amish mentioned, you can just go to ancientfilm.com and keep it real simple. But we do have a live screening of the documentary. It's about a 40, 45-minute documentary. It won't take too much of your time, but definitely plan it out. Tomorrow there is a live screening, so anyone can just go to Ancient Film, plug in your email, and we'll keep you updated on the screening for tomorrow night, give you a free pass, and keep you updated on future things that we're going to be doing through Ancient Explorers.
Well, talk about ancient technology. What about current technology? Isn't it amazing?
I love current technology, and that's why I've enveloped myself as an entrepreneur in projects that, it's really interesting to see where the public senses of interest lie. And current technology today can really shed a lot of things that are going to come down the pipe for us in the near future, George. If we look at drone technology, everyone's probably familiar now because of Amazon's great marketing campaign of, wow, in the near future I'm going to have a pizza or books delivered to me by these little aerial drones. Well, probably not. But what you are going to see, George, is let's say in the next 2 to 5 years, these drones, once they're regulated by the FAA, and they're not now, are going to be flying everywhere. Let's say in remote areas where you can't.
No question.
Yeah, let's say you can't get a Wi-Fi signal or they need to do surveillance. They can deploy drones that are solar-powered and can sit up there pretty much indefinitely and relay data. The other part of that, George, is off-planet. we can start to deploy drones, which we will, that are not specifically deployed by NASA or some conglomerate space agency, but are crowdsourced through SpaceX and various other publicly funded corporations, or privately funded corporations, where we can send drones to Mars or into the solar system, and again, allow people to have access and start to explore the surface of other planets outside of the mainstream control. And that, George, is really going to cause some interesting shakeups in modern ufology. If there is any type of cover-up on the on the moon or Mars or any of the nearby asteroids or comets that we're going to mine, we can also be there with publicly funded drones, unless they choose to shoot them all down, which would also raise an eyebrow. But we're going to have the means within the next 10 years to really start to shake up this modern ufology cover-up.
Maybe so. Jason, stick with us. We're going to come back with final phone calls for you in just a moment here on Coast to Coast AM. And if you ever need to email me, that's very simple. George at coasttocoastam.com. Also, don't forget to follow us as a Coast Insider by going to coasttocoastam.com. You can sign up for that. On our next Coast to Coast program, Jay Widener joins us. We'll talk about archons, whatever they may be. We're going to come back in a moment with Jason Martell, and we'll take your final phone calls here on Coast to Coast AM. So, Jason, do you think the Indian government stopped the search for all of this because of politics or something else?
Well, that's exactly what Amish was leading to. Was he went to all the academic references, the universities involved, all the funded archaeological digs, divers. He contacted 12 different people, from what I understand, and none of these people would talk to him or would comment. He did find one gentleman at a university, and he agreed to go on camera, and he's on the documentary. But you can even see his reluctance in the film. And I guess the simple answer is politics. Religious views and structure of India's past. As Amish put it, once questions are raised that can't be answered, they say, oh, then we can't move forward. So it's a pretty simple political backup from what we understand, that they just don't have the answers to several questions that were raised, so they choose to avoid the issue.
Can you get a little mini-sub down there?
Oh, I definitely think you could. As Amish explained, when they did these excavations in the 90s, or wrapping it up in the 90s, there are severe currents that kind of meander all through this area. So it's kind of dangerous, but we could definitely use submersibles that are either drone-powered, or if today's technology allows, which I'm sure it does. You saw the excavations of the Titanic as an example with James Cameron. So there's definitely technology that we can use, whether it's us on the scene or using drones to excavate these sites. I
wonder what kind of technology those residents of Dwarka might have had.
Well, that's where it's really interesting, George, is Dwarka is talked about in these Mahabharata tales, which coincide with other biblical tales in around 3000 BC. Right in Iraq, they talk about Anunnaki and having these aerial battles, and then they left. Well, in the same time frame, 3000 BC, the Mahabharata is talking about Krishna and having battles with other various, Hindu gods that, end up, some of these, in having weapons deployed and crashes of flying craft, Vimanas and such, right off the coast of India. So I definitely think that if we could, with a fine-tooth comb like we did here in America over Roswell, there's probably not a shred of that aircraft that crashed back in the 50s. If we could do that same type of diligence and excavations at these underwater places like Dwarka, we'd probably find an Antikythera mechanism or two, or some exotic minerals like element 117 that we know Bob Lazar used is now being acknowledged as a periodic table element. We can literally change our public perspective by going to these sites and unearthing pieces of ancient technology.
Is it possible that the battles in Samaria and the battles in Dwarka may be the same?
Well, I don't know, George, but we definitely have a time frame that's starting to correlate with the same events, meaning Sumer and Anunnaki, 3000 BC, Egypt, and the various gods that are Ra and Isis that are related in the time of 2500 BC. And then we have, in the Hindu scriptures over in India, Krishna and aerial battles happening in that place of the same 3000 BC. So there seems to be some type of connection with, again, using astronomical references to pinpoint when some of these great events took place, like these aerial battles involving Vimanas in India's past.
All right, now we go to the phones again. Let's pick it up with Jim in San Diego. Jim, thanks for holding. Go ahead.
Oh, hi, everyone. Hope all's well. And yes, I know Michael Cremo, and I've worked with him a little in the past. And I'm pretty familiar with the Dwarka. And we're just starting to scratch the surface. But I have a funny feeling about it that the Indian government has already investigated it. They may have discovered these fragments, Vimana fragments, and, they may have, do you know what the energy readings, like, they may have even found, like, paranormal sort of things there, and they have it sort of on lockdown. So they may direct you here and there, but they may just try and steer you away, or they may have picked it up already. But I think that Dwarka may be actually the Indian version of their own Area 51 Black Ops. They might have some sort of stuff locked away in their own sort of Wright-Patterson place.
What do you think of that possibility, Jason, that they know what's already down there and they don't want anybody else to?
I can't disagree with the caller. Based on the evidence we've seen of other geological, digs, archaeological digs, there's definitely always been this hand of intervention. When anything crosses over into, let's say, like the movie Stargate-like type technology, then it becomes a little bit more hard to track the path of these objects.
Yeah, it sure does. We have Xander, Manhattan. Hey, Xander, thank you for calling. Go ahead.
How you doing, Mr. Noray? Love Ancient Aliens and watching Ancient Aliens for about a couple of years now. I love the show.
Thanks, man.
I have a question to ask you. According to your guest, do you notice if anyone's ever found out about the Golden Tablet in Abydos, Egypt, with the Golden Helicopter and the Golden Airplane? And I wanted to know also, according to Bogota, Colombia, have they found out about a wooden airplane in a wooden box?
Well, I'm not so sure about the second part, but the first comment is interesting. First of all, it reminds me of the telephone game. Someone tells you, God is coming. You pass that message around to 5,000 people. It comes back to you as, God is coming with a big afro and a green spaceship. Same message, slightly tweaked. The Abydos artifacts are not actually on a gold tablet. Those are actually wall reliefs of hieroglyphics on a certain pillar on the ceiling or just above the ceiling. And modern Egyptologists say that the Abydos reliefs that show, literally anyone can Google this, Abydos artifacts, they look like a land speeder out of Star Wars and a modern-day helicopter and spaceships. Modern Egyptologists say that someone cracked away some older hieroglyphics and now it's a misinterpreted set of writings. Wrong answer. No, those are actual artifacts, just like we see in the area in other parts of Egypt, like Dendera. They appear to be holding literally large light bulbs as an explanation as to how they lit their inner tombs and crypts. So it's just an interpretation of the technology that we see.
I think those Abydos, that tablet, is one of the most fascinating things I've seen.
I do too, George, and it really makes you do a double check. Those have been around since the 90s, and they've always been under scrutiny as to being not correct because it just defies imagination that it's that blatantly obvious right in front of you.
Sure is. Okay, Moses is in Tallahassee. There you go, Moses. Thanks for calling.
Good morning, George.
Morning.
Good morning, Jason Martell.
How's it going? Thanks for calling.
Thank God for life, man. I really appreciate your work on Sumerian artifacts. I thank God for you and that information.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Again, my research started with Coast to Coast almost 20 years ago.
Wow.
And again, I thank the Most High for leading me to this program as well. Again, Jason, from my research, the word Anu, Anunnakis come from Osiris, adulterous relationship with Seth's wife, Nephis, which result in Anubis. And again, that knowledge was taken from Egypt. Cain took it to Mesopotamia, and it flooded, the whole Mesopotamian got wind of that knowledge. And again, the Anunnaki, and that information came from, again, Egypt, ancient Kemet. Can you comment on that?
Sure.
Okay, thanks, Moses. Go ahead, Chase.
Yeah, no, Moses brings up some good points there, and I was kind of touching on that earlier with some of the biblical tales talking about, the exodus of Egypt, which what we call Moses, could have actually have been one of the pharaohs called Akhenaten. And this, again, is a deeper topic, but Akhenaten was one of the people that believed in a much older epoch, let's call it back in the Golden Age, when man was more in tune with nature, and it was more of a matriarchal society rather than a patriarchal. And so, yeah, there's very interesting pieces of how we look at our past that I agree with the caller's comments. It's just going to require us to look at these topics further.
What do you think of the difference between the Sumerian story and the Dwarka story? Which one may be, in your opinion, the most incredible?
Well, just like the caller Moses brought up, there are influential cultures, whether it be the Egyptians influencing the Sumerians or the other way around. What we have to realize is that some of these texts, like the Mahabharata, are much older than even the Egyptian and Sumerian culture. It appears that ancient India extends well into the past beyond what we would currently label high civilization, which we attribute to Sumer. We just haven't found all of the connecting pieces to say it was a lost ancient culture. As an example, Dwarka is just one of these pieces where there seems to be, as you asked earlier, evidence of some type of an Atlantean culture.
Yes.
But it's global. I think Dwarka is a part of that, George. And if we go to any of the sites, even the most remote parts of the earth, Bata Valley in Indonesia or Rapa Nui, Easter Island and the Moai Heads, over and over at these ancient sites, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, all of those sites, George, depict this being, this long, slender being, hands always wrapped at the waist. Right? The Easter Island Moai Heads, they've dug out the heads, and we know that they're not heads now. They're slender beings. They're just, their bodies have been covered up. They've been buried. They always depict these slender beings. So around the world, there is evidence of this depiction of these type of beings, and all the ancient cultures seem to reference them. Who were they? Maybe this is this lost culture, but I don't have enough evidence yet to say who they are, where they came from.
Who basically put the information in the Mahabharata?
Well, who put the information in the Mahabharata is the same thing as the Sumerian cuneiform scripts. Most of this information was just recorded by people that were scribes, people who had the ability to read and write, and usually in ancient times, that was a skill, a very high skill. We can look at Sumer as a reference. I can't speak to the Mahabharata so much as what I've studied, but it's the similar reference of most of these ancient priests recorded these tales, whether it be a poem like the Mahabharata or creation myths like we have from the Sumerian epics. They literally explain that a priest sat before a god. Like in the Sumerians, literally a Sumerian priest would sit before an Anunnaki, and a scribe would be present, someone who could read and write cuneiform script. They would record everything said between the god and this priest. And then these tablets or texts, like the Mahabharata, are kept as literally sacred information. I mean, if you think about that even today, let's say an extraterrestrial comes down and sits with someone and they're typing in a database on a computer, information being relayed to a translator. That would be considered pretty much sacred information. So it's the same thing we see happening in ancient times, but using the tools they had available at that time.
We'll go to Randelette, Utah. Jason's turn now on Coast to Coast. Hey, Jason, thanks for holding so long.
Oh, it's no problem. How's it going, guys?
Good.
Jason, nice to meet you.
Jason to Jason.
Nice
Doctor?
to talk to you guys. So I wanted to start out with a comment. Stephen Hawking, and I can't remember the exact words, basically said in the billions of stars or the trillions of stars and the billions of planets, they'd be ignorant to believe that we're the only ones in the universe.
True. So true.
Yep.
Okay. So along with that, my point of view, it kind of goes along with what you guys are saying. In the billions of years that the Earth has been around, wouldn't it also be ignorant to believe that we're the first advanced civilization on Earth? Now, every civilization has always left behind some piece of technology, and I believe that's what we're witnessing with all these megalithic structures, like a monument to the previous technology or the previous civilization that had fallen, and then we'd start back over again from cavemen and work our way back up. I just can't believe that we're not smart enough. Why does it have to always be aliens have to come down here and teach us the way?
Great question. What a great question. You're hitting it right on the head, caller. We've heard of terms like the Dark Ages or the Golden Age. What we're not going to have time to cover in tonight's interview is that there is a lost cycle of time that all the ancient cultures were aware of, over 30. There's a book called Hamlet's Mill, written by one of the professors of MIT well into our past, but this book, Hamlet's Mill, speaks of over 30 cultures that were aware of a lost cycle of time. And that's exactly what we're witnessing now, is that all these ancient cultures use pretty much the heavens as a grand celestial clock. Today, we call it the precession of the equinox. And that is literally connected to the rise and fall of civilizations here on Earth. Right now, we hear of the Dark Ages, and you can think of that as kind of like HBO's Game of Thrones. The Golden Age is also spoken of a time when humanity seems to enter a state of literally enlightenment, a time when we can actually interpret God. So this is a different topic, but understand that the ancient cultures were aware of this lost cycle that lasts 24,000 years and repeats. The Mayans were the ones that just got the recent publicity around this. But it's definitely something that we need to revisit in our modern science and understand that somehow the ancients were tapping into a knowledge base that was beyond them and even beyond us today. It points to this lost ancient civilization that influenced them and is still influencing us even today.
Bob is in Trumansburg, New York, first-time caller. Bob, let's squeeze you in here. Go ahead.
It's Bruce, not Bob.
Okay.
Hey, Bruce.
And
Call me
two
Bruce.
comments. You had touched earlier on the Ark of the Covenant. The description of the way it was designed was essentially a huge capacitor. And if you were to touch that capacity, you'd be killed instantly with tens of thousands of volts. That's the reason why you'd see the two rods that they had to carry it, because anybody who touched it would have been killed.
Yes.
The other is the Sumerians have recorded an asteroid that flew over their area, and it landed up in northern Europe in the Swiss Alps or somewhere, and that explosion and that plume would have brought a heat down near Sodom and Gomorrah of over 500 degrees. In other words, the Bible describes history, but there's another thing that Moses and Jason touched about, the other caller, is that this earth, the beings that you're talking about, is there was a cannibal and overthrow thousands, if not tens of thousands of years ago. And that is what we call the modern-day Antichrist.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, what you're seeing and what you're describing and what you're finding is that past. And I think if you were to, the question I have is, the Holy Bible does mention these things, but it is hidden and some of the scripture is left out. Is what you're seeing now is what man must develop into in order to not do this again.
Well, that's a good point. Jason, thanks so much. Good luck with Ancient Explorers. For Dan Galante, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladasor, Stephanie Smith, Chris Boros, George Knapp, and Art Bell, I'm George Norrie. Somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.